My name is Sarah Hill. I'm 32 years old, and 3 days ago, I sat in my office on the 47th floor of the Bank of America Tower and listened to a 4-minute recording of my parents laughing about how I wasn't their daughter, but a high-yield asset they had been cashing in on for 8 years to the tune of $384,200. A digital file sat on my laptop screen in the middle of the Charlotte skyline like a silent, dormant virus. Its name, FamilyTruth.m4a, deceptively mundane for a recording that was about to incinerate my entire reality and everything I believed to be true about the people who raised me. In less time than it takes to pour a cup of coffee, the foundation of my life, a life built on 3 decades of sacrifice, 80-hour work weeks, and the absolute conviction that family was a sacred bond, crumbled into fine, bitter dust as I heard my mother's voice, usually reserved for charity galas in Old Myers Park, stripped of its sweetness as she told my father that they didn't actually love me. They just loved the money I had been funneling into their lives since I signed my first contract at Charlotte Asset Management. I was never a child to them. I was a biological insurance policy they had been cashing in on to fund a lifestyle they couldn't afford. And it took exactly 4 minutes and 23 seconds to realize that the people I had nearly bankrupted my own future for viewed me as nothing more than an ATM with a heartbeat. I remember thinking that morning that I was finally at peace, standing in my kitchen and looking at the Charlotte sunrise while believing that every dollar I sent back home was a brick in a wall protecting the people I loved most in the world. I honestly believed that my hard work was the only thing keeping our family whole, and that my parents saw the exhaustion in my eyes and respected the depth of the burden I was carrying for them. You know, I've been carrying this part of the story for a few days now, and it still feels like the air in the room is too thin when I talk about it. Honestly, this is the part that still sits with me, because I know I'm not the only one who has ever felt like their love was being measured in a bank balance. Leave your city and your state in the comments below. I always love knowing where people are listening from today. And please take a second to press the like button and subscribe. It helps more people find stories like this one. What I'm about to tell you next, I have never said out loud to anyone until right now. The clock on my desk showed 9:47 p.m. when the notification popped up. A digital taunt that felt like a jagged blade wrapped in silk, simply saying, "Guess who has a surprise for you?" Followed by a series of smug emojis that I have since tried to scrub from my memory. The office was an eerie vacuum of glass and steel, a high-altitude cage where the only sounds were the distant, rhythmic hum of the ventilation and the aggressive, hollow clicking of my keys as I chased another 6-figure bonus I knew I would never actually get to keep. The Charlotte skyline glittered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, a sprawling tapestry of amber and sapphire lights that stretched out toward the dark North Carolina horizon. But I barely noticed the view anymore, because after 6 years at the firm, the beauty had become invisible under the weight of my obligations. My life looked successful on paper, a perfect rendering of the American dream, as I served as a senior asset manager with a $127,000 salary and a corner office that caught the best afternoon light for the photos I never actually had time to post. I wore the charcoal gray power suits from Nordstrom. I carried the $2,000 leather tote. And I wore the mask of the reliable, successful daughter so tightly that it had started to feel like my actual skin. But every month, like clockwork, a massive portion of that salary vanished into my family's accounts. A ritualistic extraction that had started 8 years ago, just 3 weeks after I landed my first real job in the city. I had been looking at a photo of us from last Christmas just minutes before the message arrived, thinking about how lucky I was to have a family that stayed so close despite the miles and the stress. And I remember smiling at the screen and feeling a warmth that made the long hours feel worth the sacrifice. Then I clicked the file my sister Cassidy Hill had sent me, and the world stopped turning as the sound of my mother's laugh filled the quiet office. The recording was slightly muffled, captured on a phone hidden somewhere in my parents' kitchen, and I recognized the space immediately from the way the sound bounced off the subway tile and the low, constant hum of the high-end refrigerator my father had insisted I buy for them last summer. My mother, Lydia Hill, spoke first, and her laugh was a cold, transactional sound that I had never heard before, a cackle that belonged in a predatory boardroom rather than a family home. She said I really thought they loved me for who I was, and then she clarified that what they actually loved was the steady, predictable flow of my income, and I felt the air leave my lungs as if I had been punched in the chest by someone I trusted with my life. My father, Harlan Hill, followed her with a chuckle I had heard 1,000 times at backyard barbecues, but this time it was filled with an amused pity as he called me the naive one, the daughter who was so easy to lead as long as they kept pulling on the string of family loyalty. I sat there, 47 floors above the city, and watched my entire history vanish into the digital ether while I listened to my sister, the girl I had carried on my back through Carowinds and whose social media consultant lifestyle I was currently subsidizing, ask how long they thought I would keep paying before I finally noticed the holes in their stories. My mother answered without a second of hesitation, saying I would keep paying as long as I believed they needed me, because being the savior was my specific weakness, and they just had to keep the emergencies coming to keep the checks clearing. I stopped the recording before the end, unable to hear another second of the betrayal, while the city of Charlotte glowed through my window, completely indifferent to the fact that my soul was being dismantled in a glass room. I had spent $384,200 over the last 8 years, a number I knew with the obsessive, haunting precision of a forensic accountant because I had tracked every cent, thinking I was building a legacy for the people I loved. It started so small, with a $500 car repair for a truck my father said he needed to get to work. And then it became $1,000, and eventually it became the $2,400 I sent every single month to cover their mortgage in Old Myers Park. I was paying for a 5-bedroom colonial house with a manicured lawn and white shutters, while I slept in a studio apartment on the edge of the city where the radiator clanked like a dying engine and the view was nothing but a brick alleyway. I had skipped vacations. I had ignored the warning lights on my own car until the engine smoked, and I had become an expert at skipping meals just to ensure their lifestyle remained top of the line, telling myself that this was what good daughters did. I was the bridge that kept them afloat, the pillar holding up a reputation that I now realized was a perfectly curated, expensive lie. And all the while, they were viewing me as a predatory investment to be managed. The family group chat had been typical that week, with my mother reminding everyone about the 35th anniversary party at the Quail Hollow Club, an event she had been planning for 6 months with the tactical precision of a military officer. The venue was the kind of place where the grass is trimmed with nail scissors, and the membership fee is more than my annual rent. And she had already chosen the silk drapes, the crystal chandeliers, and the designer navy sheath dress she'd ordered from Neiman Marcus on my account. Most importantly, she had chosen the centerpiece of the evening, a speech from me about the power of family, followed by the presentation of a $28,000 European cruise that she had already charged to my Amex Platinum without my permission. She had laughed it off when I saw the notification, telling me it was a surprise I was giving them, and that she had already told everyone in their social circle what a saint I was for doing it. I was prepared to show up on Sunday, to give that speech, and to be the silent martyr once again, because that was the role I had been trained to play since I was a child. But as I sat in that dark office, the recording looping in my brain like a funeral march, the responsible daughter died, and I realized that I wasn't going to that party to celebrate a marriage. I was going there to conduct an audit that would leave the balance at 0. I remember the exact lingering smell of my first apartment on North Tryon Street, a heavy mix of old floor wax, damp brick, and the faint metallic scent of a radiator that clanked like a dying engine every time the North Carolina winter tried to seep through the window frames. It was a third-floor walk-up, 48 creaking steps to a door that didn't quite fit its frame. And for the first 3 weeks after I landed the job at Charlotte Asset Management, those 48 steps felt like a stairway to heaven, because I finally had a key that belonged only to me. I was 24, surviving on generic brand cereal and the pure, electric adrenaline of being the first hill to ever wear a corporate ID badge. And I used to sit on my thrift store sofa and look at my bank balance on my phone just to feel the quiet thrill of seeing a comma in the number. I had so many plans for that money. A used car that didn't shake at 60 miles per hour on the I-77. A savings account that would eventually get me out of that drafty studio. And maybe even a weekend trip to the Outer Banks, just to see the ocean without a deadline hanging over my head. I used to sit on that thrift store sofa and count my first real paycheck like it was a sacred text, believing that my value was finally being recognized by the world. And I think most of us know that quiet thrill, when you finally have a key that belongs only to you, and you think the hardest part of life is finally behind you. Then my mother called. It was a Tuesday evening, and the sun was setting behind the Charlotte skyline, casting long, dusty shadows across my linoleum floor. And her voice on the other end of the line was a sound I had never heard before, a jagged, breathless sob that made my stomach drop into my shoes. She told me that my father's truck had finally given up, that the engine had seized in the middle of a delivery, and that without $500 for the immediate repair, he would lose the contract and they would lose the house in Myers Park. I didn't even let her finish the sentence before I was opening my laptop, my fingers trembling with a frantic, desperate pride as I initiated the transfer. Because in that moment, I wasn't just a girl in a drafty apartment. I was a hero. I remember thinking, this is why I worked so hard, to be the one who finally stands between my family and the edge. I think there's a specific kind of pride that comes with being the first one in a family to actually have something to give. A feeling that your success isn't real until it's being used to save someone else. I think most of us who have lived that story know the trap where you mistake being needed for being loved, simply because the alternative is too quiet to bear. That $500 was the first drop in a leak that would eventually become a flood. A slow erosion of my own life to shore up the foundations of theirs. And at the time, I was too blinded by the validation of being the responsible one to see the pattern. Within 6 months, that one-time emergency had mutated into a monthly ritual. $1,000 here for a medical bill that never seemed to arrive in the mail, and another $1,200 there for a property tax oversight that my mother whispered about as if it were a family secret we had to bury together. I stayed in that studio on North Tryon for 3 more years, renewing the lease while the walls grew thinner and the view of the brick alleyway became my only horizon. All while my parents were hosting garden parties in the Myers Park backyard, I was effectively subsidizing. I became an expert at intermittent fasting, not because it was a health trend, but because the Hill family lifestyle was a hungry ghost I had to feed before I could afford to feed myself. And I would tell my friends I was too busy with work to go out to dinner, when the truth was that my grocery budget had been sacrificed to pay for my father's new premium cable package. Honestly, looking back at that apartment and how hard I tried to keep them happy, it still sits with me. You've been around long enough to know when the weight on your shoulders isn't yours to carry. And I'm curious what you think about this. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done if this was your family asking for just a little more every single month? And please, take a second to press the like button and subscribe. It helps more people find stories like this one. Because what my sister decided to do next, I don't think anyone expected it, including her. Then came my sister, Cassidy. She is 6 years younger than me, the free spirit of the family, who moved through life with a casual, unearned grace, while I moved through it with a spreadsheet and a permanent headache. When she was accepted into Queen's University of Charlotte, my mother called me crying again. Not about an emergency this time, but about the tragedy of Cassidy having to take out student loans that would crush her creative soul before she even had a chance to fly. I was 27 then, finally promoted to a junior advisor role and starting to see a real future for myself. But the family first rhetoric was a collar I had worn so long I didn't even notice the weight of it anymore. I took over her tuition, a staggering $78,000 over 4 years, because I wanted her to have the lightness I never had. And I wanted my mother to look at me the way she looked at Cassidy, with uncomplicated, radiating affection. I was her shield, the one who worked the 80-hour weeks at the Bank of America Corporate Center so she could spend her afternoons at high-end cafes in South End, finding herself over $15 avocado toasts and boutique spin classes that I quietly paid for through the authorized user card my mother had insisted she have for emergencies. I remember one night, I was sitting in my office at midnight, my eyes blurring over a client's portfolio, when I got a notification for a $400 charge at a boutique on Selwyn Avenue under Cassidy's name. I called my mother, my voice thick with exhaustion, asking why a designer jacket was considered a family emergency, and she just sighed, that disappointed, weary sigh that always made me feel like I was the one being unreasonable. She told me that Cassidy had an important networking event, that her image was her career, and that I shouldn't be so transactional with my own flesh and blood. That was the word they used to keep me in line. Transactional. Whenever I questioned a charge, whenever I asked when the loans might be repaid, they would pivot to the sacredness of the family bond, making me feel as if my concern for my own financial survival was a moral failing. I was the senior manager, the one who had everything under control, which meant I was the one who was expected to absorb the pain so they didn't have to feel the consequences of their own choices. I kept telling myself that I was the one holding the line, that my exhaustion was a badge of honor because it meant they were safe. And I lived in that lie for 8 years, building a life of charcoal suits and leather totes that hid the fact that my actual net worth was a hollow shell. I thought I was the pillar of the Hill legacy, the strong one who would eventually be rewarded with the love and respect I had earned through sheer endurance. Never realizing that to them, a pillar isn't something you love. It's just something you expect to stand there and hold the roof up until it finally cracks. I remember standing in the Myers Park house during one of those garden parties, watching my mother laugh with her friends from the junior league, her hand resting on a new marble countertop I had just finished paying for. She looked so happy, so secure, and for a moment, I allowed myself to believe that her happiness was a reflection of my worth. I stood there thinking, if I keep this up, if I just work a little harder, eventually they'll see me. Eventually they'll realize that I'm the one who kept the roof over their heads when the world tried to take it. But as I watched my sister take a selfie in the reflection of the new stainless steel appliances, I didn't see gratitude in her eyes. I only saw an expectation that the world would always provide, as long as I was the one doing the providing. The afternoon before that audio file arrived had been remarkably quiet, almost peaceful, as I sat on my small balcony in the humid Charlotte air, watching the first few fireflies begin to blink over the treetops of the nearby park. I remember feeling a strange, rare sense of accomplishment, thinking that for once, the family group chat was silent, because everyone was finally content and secure in the lives I was so carefully funding. I even took a photo of the sunset to send to my mother, wanting to share that little sliver of beauty with the woman I still believed was my biggest supporter and my closest confidant. I truly believed, for those few hours, that I was finally safe in the circle of their love. The air was thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and wood smoke from a neighbor's grill, and for a moment, the tension that usually lived in my shoulders simply evaporated. I thought I had finally bought enough peace to last us through the summer. I stood there thinking, she has been waiting for me to realize this, hasn't she? My mother hasn't been cheering for my success. She has been calculating the interest on my soul. Then the notification chimed, and the peace of that humid evening was replaced by the cold, digital glow of my phone screen. I was back in my office at the Bank of America Corporate Center, the city lights of North Carolina sprawling out below me like a million unblinking eyes, when I finally pressed play on the file my sister had sent with such casual cruelty. The sound quality was sharp, a high-definition betrayal that captured every intake of breath and every clink of a wine glass against the granite countertops of their kitchen in Myers Park. I heard my mother, Lydia Hill, let out a light, airy laugh, the kind of sound she usually saved for dismissing a minor social faux pas at a luncheon, as she told my father that I actually believed they loved me for who I was. I felt the air in my office grow thin, my lungs tightening until every breath felt like it was being pulled through a straw, as she explained that what they really loved was the steady, predictable flow of my income. My father, Harlan Hill, didn't defend me. He didn't even pause to offer a single word of fatherly affection. But instead, he let out a low, amused chuckle that sounded like a predator watching a particularly slow-witted prey. He called me the naive one, the daughter who was so easy to manage because all you had to do was pull on the string of family loyalty, and I would dance to whatever tune they played. The humiliation was a physical weight, a heat that started in my chest and radiated outward until my skin felt too tight for my body, as I realized that my 8 years of sacrifice were being discussed like a successful business transaction over a bottle of $40 Cabernet I had likely paid for. I sat there in the dark, watching my own reflection in that office window, and I thought about every person I had ever trusted without question. I realized that my mother had spent years seeding the idea that I was the unstable one, the one who worked too hard and needed the family to keep her grounded, while in reality, I was the only one who was actually grounded in the truth of our finances. She had built a narrative where my generosity was framed as a desperate plea for their love, making me look like the pathetic one in front of our entire social circle in Charlotte, while she played the role of the humble, struggling matriarch. The realization that my father, a man I had once respected for his supposed integrity, was a willing accomplice in this charade was the final, devastating blow that broke the last of my childhood illusions. I stayed in my office until the sun began to peek over the Blue Ridge Mountains in the distance, the light turning the glass towers of the city into pillars of fire. And I began to build a new kind of ledger. I opened a fresh spreadsheet and titled it The Cost of Deception. And I started entering every transfer, every loan, and every emergency payment I had ever made to them, the numbers glowing on the screen like an indictment. I realized then that my sister hadn't sent me that recording as a warning or a moment of sisterly clarity. She had sent it because she wanted to see if she could break me, to see if the responsible one would finally collapse under the weight of her own realization. She wanted the entertainment of my grief. But what she was going to get was the cold, clinical efficiency of an auditor who had just found a massive discrepancy in the books. I had to know if the person I called sister was truly gone. And as I watched the notification for another declined transaction on my Amex Platinum pop up on my screen, I knew that the time for silence was over. It was a charge for Viking Cruises, totaling $28,450. The air in my office felt suddenly freezing, and I watched my hands begin to shake as I realized the sheer audacity of the theft. My mother hadn't even waited for me to offer a gift. She had simply reached into my life and taken $30,000 of my future to fund a 3-week European tour through Paris and Rome, all while expecting me to stand on a stage at the Quail Hollow Club and pretend it was my idea. I stood there thinking, if I sign off on this, if I let this charge stand, there is no Sarah Hill left. There is only the machine they built to harvest me until I am hollow. I told myself that I was done being the silent martyr, and I prepared for the storm that was about to hit Myers Park. But before I could even close the spreadsheet, my phone began to vibrate in the silence of the room. It was my mother. I let the phone ring until the very last second, watching the Charlotte skyline through the window, before I finally answered with a voice that was flat and professional. The synthetic sweetness in her tone was like a honeyed poison as she asked if there was a misunderstanding with my credit card because my sister was currently standing in a boutique on Selwyn Avenue with a declined transaction and a very embarrassed expression. I told her simply that I had frozen the cards and canceled the cruise, and the silence that followed was a terrifying vacuum that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. When she spoke again, the charm had evaporated, replaced by a metallic, high-pitched defense, as she reminded me of the family's image in the community and the guests who were already expecting the announcement on Sunday. She didn't apologize, and she didn't offer an explanation. Instead, She informed me that if I didn't show up to the Quail Hollow Club and act like the responsible daughter they had raised, she would be forced to take matters into her own hands. She told me she had already drafted an email to the CEO of Charlotte Asset Management, expressing the family's deep concern over my mental health crisis and my recent unstable behavior. She threatened to destroy the very career I had used to fund her life, using my own success as the thing she used against me to force my compliance. I hung up the phone and sat in silence, realizing that the woman who had tucked me into bed for 18 years was willing to incinerate my entire professional existence just to protect a $28,000 vacation and a lie about an anniversary. Then, my sister video called me from my childhood bedroom, sprawled among the trophies I'd won for a family that never really appreciated my efforts. And she laughed as she told me she'd sent the recording just to see when the good daughter would finally succumb to the weight of her own self-imposed sanctity. She called me beige and accommodating, mocking the very sacrifices that were currently paying the mortgage on the house she was sitting in. I didn't argue with her, and I didn't beg for her to understand. Instead, I quietly hit the record button on my laptop, capturing every word of her admission and every sneer of her contempt. Wednesday morning in Charlotte arrived with a heavy gray mist that clung to the glass of the Bank of America Corporate Center, making the entire city feel as though it were underwater. And I walked into Not Just Coffee on 7th Street, feeling like a ghost in a charcoal power suit. My best friend, Audrey Thorne, a woman who had been my roommate during those lean years at Northwestern, and who was now a senior corporate litigator at one of the most aggressive firms in the Queen City, was already seated at a corner table. She didn't offer a polite smile or ask about the weather. She simply pushed a steaming oat milk latte toward me and opened her leather-bound legal pad, her pen poised like a surgeon's scalpel. I had sent her the audio file at 3 a.m, and I could see from the tightness around her eyes that she had spent the remaining hours dissecting the digital DNA of my family's betrayal. I handed her my phone, and as the recording played through her earbuds, I watched her face transform into the ice water mask that made her a legend in the Mecklenburg County Courthouse. When the audio finished, she didn't look away, but instead, she leaned across the table and gripped my wrist with a strength that grounded me in the cold, harsh reality of the moment. She told me that what I was experiencing was a calculated operation of financial exploitation, a strategic drain on my life that had been hidden under the velvet cloak of family tradition for nearly a decade. She explained that while North Carolina is a one-party consent state for recordings, the fact that my sister had sent the file willingly as a taunt made it a powerful piece of evidence regarding their intent and the total lack of any reasonable expectation of privacy. I sat there thinking, I am not just a victim of G. Hill. I am the subject of a long-term forensic fraud, and the people who signed my birth certificate are the ones who forged the ledger. It was the first time I allowed myself to see the situation without the filter of daughterly loyalty, and the clarity was so sharp it felt like a physical wound. I realized that every time I had questioned my own sanity, every time I had felt like I was being transactional or cold, I was actually just catching a glimpse of the truth they were working so hard to hide. I spent the rest of that Thursday and all of Friday in a state of high-functioning peace, moving through my meetings at Charlotte Asset Management with a clinical detachment that allowed me to perform my duties while my mind was already in the ballroom at Quail Hollow. I prepared the blood-red expansion folder, printing out 8 years of bank statements, wire transfers, and the metadata-verified transcript of the recording. Each page was a witness to a different sacrifice I had made. The $500 for the truck, the $78,000 for tuition, the monthly mortgage payments, all of it laid out in black and white. I realized that my mother had spent years seeding the idea that I was the unstable one to our entire social circle, painting herself as the grieving matriarch while she used my success to fund her reputation. That Thursday evening, I walked down the quiet hallway of my building on North Tryon Street and knocked on the door of Unit 4C, where my neighbor, Caleb Brooks, lived. Caleb was a documentary filmmaker, a man whose life was built on capturing the unvarnished truth of a moment, and I had often seen him coming home with his camera bags and a look of tired peace that I never seemed to find in my own reflection. He opened the door, leaning against the frame with his sleeves rolled up, and I saw his eyes move from my face to the folder I was clutching against my chest like a shield. I asked him for a favor, telling him that I needed a witness for an event at the Quail Hollow Club on Sunday, someone who wasn't part of the Hill social circle, someone who could see the truth if the walls started to close in on me. He didn't ask a dozen questions, and he didn't offer a platitude about how things would eventually work out, but instead, he just nodded slowly and told me he was in, promising to bring his professional camera equipment because people often behave better when they think they're being archived for history. Saturday became a different kind of challenge, a digital storm of noise as my mother mobilized the entire Hill network to pressure the dissenting daughter back into the fold. My phone was a constant vibration of messages from aunts in Myers Park and cousins in South Carolina, all of them repeating the same script about how family forgives and how I shouldn't ruin the 35th anniversary over a financial misunderstanding. My mother had worked fast, seeding a story that I was having a breakdown from the stress of my job, painting herself as the victim and me as the unstable child who was jeopardizing a sacred milestone because of my own liquidity issues. I didn't respond to any of them, not because I was angry, but because I realized they weren't actually talking to me. They were talking to the version of me that my mother had invented. My mother had called me that morning just to ask if I'd seen the photos of the floral arrangements, her voice the same as it always was, warm, unhurried, and filled with a motherly pride that felt entirely real. I told her the flowers looked beautiful and that I'd be there on time. I think she already knew exactly what she was going to do to my career later that day if I didn't fall in line. That moment of false normalcy was the hardest to swallow. The way she could talk about peonies and silk drapes while holding a knife to my professional throat was a level of sociopathy I wasn't prepared for. The entrance to the Quail Hollow Club looked like a neoclassical fortress of white stone and perfectly manicured hedges as Caleb steered his older Honda Civic into a spot between a Porsche and a Range Rover. I looked down at the red folder in my lap, and it felt solid and heavy as a promise. The grand ballroom glowed through tall, arched windows, and inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive peonies and the stifling humidity of 85 people pretending to be perfect. My mother, Lydia Hill, stood at the entrance in her designer navy sheath dress, her throat adorned with the Mikimoto pearls I'd bought her. She saw me approach, and her eyes went razor sharp, scanning me for the mental instability she'd been seeding. She pulled me into a hug that felt like a vice, her lips brushing my ear with a chilling whisper as she told me that if I did anything to embarrass her tonight, she would make sure I never held a position in this city again. I hugged her back, my heart rate steady, and I told her that she had been destroying me for 8 years, and tonight I was just giving everyone else the opportunity to watch. Honestly, standing there and looking at her, I realized that what comes next was going to be one of the hardest choices of my life. If you were in my exact position, Sign those papers and keep the peace, or open that folder and tell the truth. What would you do? Leave a yes or no in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you think. And please take a second to press the like button and subscribe. It helps more people find stories like this one. Here's what I actually decided to do, and it changed everything that came after. I stood up when the event coordinator tapped the microphone, the metallic ring of the sound cutting through the low murmur of polite conversation like a gunshot. I felt 85 pairs of eyes turn toward me. The senior asset manager, the saintly daughter, the woman who had spent 8 years being the silent engine of the Hill family's social survival. I picked up the blood-red expansion folder, and as I walked toward the dais, the click of my heels on the polished hardwood sounded like a countdown in the back of my mind. The grand ballroom of the Quail Hollow Club felt smaller than it had 10 minutes ago, the air thick with the scent of lilies and the heavy, humid expectation of a room full of people waiting to be lied to. I looked out at the 10 round tables draped in ivory silk, seeing my mother, Lydia Hill, lean back in her chair with a small, triumphant smile, her hand instinctively touching the Mikimoto pearls at her throat. She thought she had won. She thought the threat she'd whispered in my ear at the entrance, the one about destroying my career with a single email, had finally forced me into the role she had written for me. The spotlight was warm on my face, a blinding, artificial glow that made the rest of the room fall away into a blur of designer suits and expensive jewelry. I took the microphone, its cool, weighted surface feeling solid in my hand, and for a heartbeat, I just stood there, breathing in the silence. I told them that 35 years was a remarkable milestone for any marriage, and that I had spent the last decade being incredibly proud to contribute to the legacy my parents had built. I watched my father, Harlan Hill, look up from his plate with a brief flicker of what looked like relief, but I knew it was just the comfort of a man who thought his secrets were safe for another night. I told the room that I had recently sat down to calculate the exact cost of a family legacy, and I asked them if they wanted to know what it looked like when you put a dollar amount on devotion. I projected my voice to the back of the ballroom, stating the figure of $384,200, and I heard the first ripple of confusion pass through the crowd, the soft sound of forks hitting china and the sharp intake of breath from the tables nearest the stage. I opened the red folder and began to read from the ledger of deception, breaking down the numbers with the same clinical efficiency I used to manage the portfolios of the Queen City's wealthiest clients. I told them about the $2,400 monthly mortgage payments for a house in Myers Park I wasn't allowed to call home, the $78,000 in tuition for a sister who had never held a job, and the $28,000 European cruise that had been charged to my Amex Platinum without a single word of permission. My mother stood up then, her face a mask of calculated fury, her voice high and trembling as she screamed that I was having a mental health crisis and that the stress of the city had finally broken my mind. Honestly, the air in that ballroom was so thin, I could feel my own heart beating in my throat. And I realized that I was finally standing in the truth I had been running from for years. There's something about this moment that sits with me, the feeling of finally letting go of a secret that was never yours to keep. Has someone ever taken something from you that wasn't theirs to take, leaving you to wonder how you were supposed to start explaining it to people who only saw the surface? You don't have to share the whole story, but just leave a heart below if you've been there. And please take a second to press the like button and subscribe. It helps more people find stories like this one. Because what my mother did next, when she realized the crowd was beginning to doubt her, I don't think even the attorneys were prepared for it. I stepped closer to the microphone, my voice remaining calm and professional, even as my mother tried to climb the stairs to the dais to stop me. I told the room that the money was the least of it, that the real cost was the discovery of what the people I loved actually thought of the person paying their bills. I reached into the pocket of my charcoal blazer and took out my phone, connecting it to the ballroom's high-end Bluetooth system with a steady hand. I told 85 of the most influential people in Charlotte that I wanted them to hear the voice of the woman they had spent the night praising. I pressed play, and Lydia Hill's laugh filled the room, amplified and distorted by the speakers until it sounded like a jagged, transactional cackle. I watched the faces in the crowd, the aunts from Myers Park, the cousins from South Carolina, the business partners of the CEO, as they heard my mother explain that she didn't actually love me, she just loved the ATM with a heartbeat I had become. My father's amused chuckle followed, calling me the naive daughter who was so easy to manage as long as they pulled on the family string. The playback lasted exactly 47 seconds, but in that time, the oxygen was sucked out of the room, leaving a pressurized vacuum of collective social fallout that I knew would never be repaired. I stood there thinking, I am not just a daughter anymore. I am the auditor who is finally closing the account on a decade of fraud. The fallout was immediate and visceral. My mother screamed for someone to turn off the AI-generated fake, her hands shaking so violently that her wine glass shattered against the edge of the table. But the silence from the rest of the room was an indictment. I looked at my sister, Cassidy Hill, whose face had gone a sickly ashen gray as she realized that her mockery had become the very thing that would dismantle the life she loved. I walked down from the dais, the red folder tucked firmly under my arm, and the crowd parted like a sea of silk and expensive wool, no one daring to make eye contact as I passed. I found Aunt Meredith sitting near the exit, and she reached out to squeeze my hand with a grip that felt like iron, whispering that I had finally found the courage that the rest of the family had been lacking for 50 years. I walked toward the exit with Caleb Brooks right behind me, his camera equipment already packed away, his presence the only grounding force in a world that had just been torn apart. The evening air of North Carolina hit my face like a cold, cleansing wave, washing away the stagnant scent of peonies and the stifling humidity of the ballroom. As we reached his Honda Civic, I felt a strange, hollow sensation in my chest. Not the pain of a fresh wound, but the lightness of a heavy, suffocating backpack finally being unbuckled and dropped into the dirt after a decade of climbing. I looked at the Charlotte skyline glittering in the distance, no longer a cage or a destination I had to earn, but simply a place where I was finally allowed to exist without a price of admission. The following morning, I sat across from Audrey Thorne at a small diner in Dilworth, the smell of dark roast coffee and frying bacon a world away from the sterile luxury of the Quail Hollow Club. She pushed a steaming oat milk latte toward me, her eyes sharp and professional, as she reviewed the metadata of the recording and the bank statements I had provided. She told me that while North Carolina is a one-party consent state, the fact that my sister had initiated the delivery of the file as a taunt removed any reasonable expectation of privacy, making it a powerful piece of evidence if we needed to pursue civil fraud charges. I sat there thinking, I am no longer a victim of my own loyalty. I realized that the people who signed my birth certificate were the same ones who had spent 8 years forging the ledger of my life. And for the first time, I allowed myself to see the situation with the cold, clinical clarity of a professional. I'm just taking a quiet moment here before I tell you how the Hill family legacy finally ended. Before I tell you what became of the woman who raised me, what does justice look like to you in a situation where love was always treated like a business deal? Drop it in the comments below, and then, after you hear the final outcome, tell me, was it enough? And please take a second to press the like button and subscribe. It helps more people find stories like this one. Because what came next was something that even the board members at the Bank of America Tower hadn't seen in their entire careers. The aftermath in Charlotte wasn't a sudden explosion, but a slow, inevitable dismantling of a reputation that had been built on a foundation of stolen money. My mother and my father were forced to refinance the Colonial House in Old Myers Park because without my $2,400 monthly transfers, the lifestyle they had curated was financially impossible. Lydia Hill lost her seat on the foundation board as the social circle she valued most began to distance themselves from the recording, and my father's occasional consulting work evaporated as word of his complicity spread through the city's professional networks. My sister, Cassidy, eventually had to move into a small, one-bedroom studio near the university, finally learning to navigate a world where her boutique wardrobe wasn't subsidized by a sister she held in contempt. I think I kept forgiving them and sending that money because I needed to believe that the people who had known me my whole life couldn't truly want to use me as a biological insurance policy. I understood then that I had been waiting for someone to give me permission to be the hero of my own story, never realizing that the only person who could sign that order was the woman I saw in the mirror every morning. I confused loyalty with trust for a long time, and that was my mistake, not theirs. I still drive past the Bank of America Tower sometimes on my way to the park, and I just keep going. I just don't look back anymore.